Hi, my name is Dan, and this video is one in a series of videos that I'm doing about designing enemies for video games, which is part of a larger suite of videos that I am doing on game design in general. And in this one, I want to talk about enemy AI, and specifically about the tactics that they might use in combat. And there are a few things that I want to talk about that are things that you need to think about as you're designing your enemies. Um, uh, but one of the problems that I'm facing with this is that actually it's a huge subject, and I don't want to do a huge video. I want to just do a kind of introduction to it in that sense. Now, I don't know what stage you're at when you're watching this video, how much experience you've got. If you've played a lot of games, you might be very aware of the way AI works for enemies. If you've ever tried making a game for yourself, then you might have had to deal with enemy AI, and so it may be that your knowledge of this area is beyond what I'm going to talk about in this video, because basically I'm going to talk about the fundamentals of this and give a kind of few examples and a few thoughts. Because my aim is really for people who have kind of approached this idea of designing games, want to learn more, want to get some practice potentially at this, but also maybe approaching the idea of, well, what does it mean to have enemy AI for the first time? So I just wanted to put it in context of that. So there are three areas that I'm going to talk about, which are in turn the aggro, the actual fighting, and then about losing aggro or de-aggroing. So we'll come up to them as we come across along. So I presume the fact that you're watching this video means that you have some quite strong interest in video games, in which case you probably understand what is meant by aggroing an enemy. But that is the point where the enemy decides that you're a threat and is going to fight you. And there are various things involved with this, potentially, and there are different tactics that you can take depending on your game. So the first aspect of this is detection. So it's when the enemy becomes aware that you are present somewhere nearby. And there are several ways that this can happen. It can be done by sight. So if they see you, a line of sight. It can be done by a radius. So if you're within a certain distance, it can be done by sound. And what is quite common actually is some combination of either two or three of those. And sometimes you might have heard of people talk about sight cones. And so that's a combination between the radius and having the line of sight. And so this means that you have to be within a certain radius for it to for them to become aware of you, but also they have to be facing you, or facing you enough that they see you. So you can creep up behind them, and it may be that you've got the sound added in, so that if you get close enough behind them, they will hear you and they will turn around, or that you've got a different radius for behind them, where if you get within it, they will, it'll act as if they've heard you and turn around. So you can use sorts of combinations between these things. However, detection is not the same as aggro, or it doesn't have to be. And there are situations in which you might have entities in a game that are aware of you but are not attacking you. And there may be various reasons for this. So let's move on to the actual aggro. So there are several different tactics that you could have here, and I guess the most fundamental tactic is to say that nothing will attack you, or an enemy will not be aggressive and will not attack you under any circumstances. In which case, that's not an enemy, is my argument. So I would say let's put that one aside. So an automatic aggro is when as soon as the enemy detects you, they drop whatever it is that they're doing and go into attack mode, and they're going to come and get you. Sometimes you have aggro only when attacked, so you have creatures. Um, kind of in my head, I've got things like World of Warcraft and Skyrim, where you've got kind of passive creatures that are standing around, but once you attack them, they'll fight back. But also, in Skyrim, the townsfolk, if you don't attack them, they're fine. They won't attack you. But if you make a mistake and attack them or do it on purpose, who on earth would do that? Then you get attacked as a result. Um, Sometimes there's an element of level difference between it, and I'm particularly thinking about World of Warcraft here. When I used to play back in many years ago, it feels like now. Um, as you progressed, the attack radius for the mobs, as which is a term that's sometimes used for enemies in games, it was particularly used in World of Warcraft. So the attack radius for a mob in World of Warcraft shrank as your relative level got higher. So as you became higher and higher, it was kind of, um, I guess, justified in terms of the rationale, in that they were wary of attacking you because they could see that you were big and tough, and so why would they bother going in for certain death? Actually, there's the gameplay reason for it is so that higher level players, if they're just running through a low level area, don't get mobbed by lots of enemies, and yeah, it makes it easier for them. So it was it was probably more a gameplay decision than an actual kind of justified decision in the sense of realistic behaviour. And you could wander within, very close to things that would normally be aggressive, as long as you were hugely higher level than them. And I guess the catch-all is triggered by something else, or triggered by anything else that you want. So it could be triggered by walking through a trigger. It could be triggered by attacking one of their friends. It could be triggered by stealing something from their home, for example. Or there's all sorts of things that you could do for events that could trigger things to aggro. It could be done by, by picking up the golden chalice that's in the middle of the on the pedestal in the middle of the room. Those statues that you thought were just statues. Well, of course, you're a video game player and you know they're not just statues, but when you pick up that golden chalice, that's what triggers them attacking you. Okay. So, moving on into the fighting. So, this is the bit that can get very complicated at times. And AI for fighting, combined with the AI for the aggroing and the de-aggroing, which we'll come to, is often done in some kind of scripted way, maybe with some sort of decision tree or some kind of state chart approach to these things. And this is where I kind of feel like there are so many different options that I don't want to try even to describe them all. And as games are getting more sophisticated, there's a lot more subtlety going on inside the AI for fighting for enemies, which is good because it starts to feel more and more realistic. Which I guess is good, that you feel like you're fighting real people and real things rather than fantasy ones, but I don't know. Anyway, so there are lots of options. What I'm going to do is I'm going to run through some standards. Um, I'm not trying to be comprehensive here. So this is a picture of a skeever in Skyrim, and I describe this as being the melee monster, which is very straightforward. Basically, they can only attack when you're up close and personal. So they're going to get to the player, they're going to use melee attacks. If the player tries to get away, they're going to follow them. They maybe can go faster than the player anyway. They have no fear, they're just going to fight until they're dead. Um, yeah, there we go. And then we've got, again, a fairly standard thing of shooting your enemy and them shooting back at you. So, Strafing Soldier, I call this one. So they need to get into range. So if they may detect you from a further distance than is an ideal distance for them to shoot from. So they'll move forwards until they're in range, and then they'll start to use ranged attacks. It's possible. I mean, I've called it a strafing soldier. Not all ranged attack enemies will strafe. Just in case you don't know, strafe means walking sideways while shooting forwards, effectively. although actually what you're really doing is going in a circle around your enemy. Um, and this term, which the term actually comes from real warfare of spreading bullets over an area, but it's been adopted in video games as meaning this moving. And the point of strafing is so that you become a harder target to hit. There's a kind of another question within this, which is, I mean, there's obviously variations inside this, which is if the player starts to move towards you, are you as the enemy going to back off if you can to try and maintain your distance, or are you just going to let that happen and then if they get close enough, keep shooting them at a short distance or get out a melee weapon? Um, this is, I can't remember which screenshot I got for this. Is this the Division 2? It might be. I'm going to call this one the cover coward. I have this thing about doing some illustration here. So yeah, so your enemy they find cover, they're moving to so yeah, the first thing they do when they detect an enemy is the question is where's my nearest bit of cover, and that has to bear in mind where the position of the player is, and then they move into cover, and then they'll do peeping and shooting. And I guess then there's potential extensions to this in terms of if the player approaches, do you back off? Do you move around the cover? Do you try and creep up on them? But yeah, that's the basics of that. And then finally, I've got a picture of a worm boss from Portal Knights here. I'm going to talk about bosses, and I'm calling this the scripted Singleton. One pretty common approach to bosses in particular is to have effectively two or maybe three types of attack that they can have. And you start with attack type 1, and whilst they're in attack type 1, they're pretty much invulnerable, and the player can't do anything to them. And that'll last for a certain length of time or until the player achieves something that's kind of maybe outside the boss themselves. And then they turn into attack type 2. And once they're in attack type 2, this is an attack type where the player does get the ability to attack. So often, attack type 1 is ranged, and attack type 2 is, and maybe with some kind of guarding or shielding. Attack type 2 is some kind of melee when they flop down in front of you and you get the ability to actually get them somehow. And then usually once they've taken damage, it's a significant amount of damage at once, and it's not about pecking away at these things often, rather than just going through this cycle 3 or 4 times. They'll rear back and take the damage, and then they'll go back to the start of the attack type 1. Sometimes they might have a few different attacks, so the first phase might be attack type 1. There might be a 2 or 3 more different attack types as they go through that become harder to deal with, or they might become more ferocious as they go through. The other approach for bosses that I've seen quite often is specific scripted special abilities I've spelled out wrong there, but at specific health levels. So as you attack the boss, they have at least some vulnerability, and then when they get down to and it's reasonably common, I would say, to say that when they get down to 75% health, then they do something that's particularly difficult to deal with. Maybe conjure a few additional enemies for you to fight, and they become invulnerable until you've got rid of the ones that they've conjured. And there could be 3 different things that they do at 75%, 50%, and 25%. And this is quite typical for MMO bosses, for example, that you have to learn uh, tactics to deal with those specific stages and how you're going to deal with them. Um, Having scripting in your AI is quite a common thing, obviously, and having kind of different stages of what they'll do, or kind of different sub attack modes. So maybe they're kind of, not necessarily your singletons or your bosses. A more complicated AI might involve scripting and saying, well, we're going to make a random choice between I'm going to do melee or I'm going to step back and do ranged, or choice of when they might use their action points to use specific actions. And again, this is an area where trying to chase down every possibility is obviously impossible. And so there are many others. There's all sorts of things that can be thrown in there. I'm just going to throw a few other thoughts in there. So teamwork. So I've really only talked about enemies that are solo enemies at this point in time. Um, and it is possible for them to work together, and that can produce all sorts of sophisticated behavior. They could raise the alarm, so that's kind of connected with teamwork. But if you're attacking a governmental facility and you're you find the first guard and you attack the guard, then I guess in real life one of the first things that they would do is try and raise their alarm and get some help to come. And so some games do that. One of the reasons I think that more games don't do this is because it produces the situation where you potentially have a lot of enemies converging on the player at once and makes it quite difficult for the player. Um, and running away. So very few enemies in games that I've seen seem to do this, but I have seen enemies where when they get down to a certain level of health, they go, this isn't working. I better try and run away, and so they back off or completely try and disengage from combat and run as far as they can. And it's particularly hard to deal with, of course, especially if they can run faster than the player. Uh, One thing I often talk about with AI with games is more obvious in some ways with AI for racing games, which is obviously not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about enemies, um, which is that it's possible to calculate the perfect racing line for an AI driver to take. And so AI for driving games is often more about actually how do you add in mistakes and how do you create some artificial stupidity. And this can be the same thing in combat as well for enemies. Is that it will be possible to program in pretty devastating tactics for your enemies. And either you can go down the approach of just making them weaker so that the player can cope with their superior tactics, or the fact that they'll do this, or you can start going down the line of processing mistakes and getting random chances of them doing something odd where it's not to their benefit. So, art, yeah, so artificial intelligence. This isn't in some ways is bringing in more personality or artificially making them more human. Although if you're dealing with animals, animals make mistakes as well. But this is more human in the terms of humans make mistakes versus computers that don't make mistakes. Okay. So the final one of the three stages I'm going to talk about is losing the player, and what happens if the player tries to run away and disengage from combat. And I think that sometimes this is a thing that, as a designer, you don't necessarily think about because you're not maybe not expecting this to happen. When you're actually creating the game and testing it, it becomes more obvious that this is something that you need to be dealing with potentially. So there's a question of: are you going to take the enemy into a stage into a state where they're not in combat anymore, de-aggroing? If so, never. So they're going to uh, pursue the player no matter what. And sometimes this seems to involve them having an almost supernatural knowledge of where the player is, and then using their pathfinding to go and find them. Are they going to lose do this if they lose sight of the player? So that can happen. Or if they're too far from home, by which I mean wherever their starting location or kind of central location from their starting patrol, if they're a patrolling enemy. So it's possible to say that yeah, they're not going to go too far from where they're supposed to be, and it's possible to actually combine these things together again. Um, they One tactic that you can take is, instead of going straight from the idea of I'm in combat to actually nothing's happened and going back to normal, it's a bit more realistic to have some kind of in between behavior, which is a bit like a cool down kind of behavior of being wary. So they know that the player has been around and they might be on the lookout for them. You could even make them more alert in some way. But there are obviously a few things that you can do specifically with that. So you can go to last known location for the player, so the last place they saw the player before they disappeared. Obviously, this is particularly useful if you're de-aggroing from line of sight. And the other one is to actively seek the player, so to actually start looking around and either randomly or in some kind of organized search pattern where they're trying to find the player. Um, anyway, at some point, if you manage to hide, or if you don't have any kind of wary behavior in between, then your enemy is going to want to go back to normal in some way. And there's a couple of ways to do that. So the first way is that you can take them back to where they started, effectively back to their starting state of the game. If they're patrolling, you could say back to the nearest place on their patrolling route. This is kind of assuming that they've been drawn away from this by the player, which is kind of on the assumption that if you run away, maybe they'll actually chase you a little bit. Or you could carry on from where you stopped. So if you're, particularly if you've got a player that, not a player, an enemy that just meanders randomly anyway, which is a thing obviously you can do with enemies, then is there any reason not to just carry on from where you are? There are obviously gameplay issues for both of those tactics. So if you're going back to where you are, that means that you're getting this enemy consistently guards a specific point. And if you don't, if you have carrying on from where they were left, this can actually be used as a tactic by the player to draw an enemy away from a location they want to get to make it easier to get in. And very big words here. It's a very normal thing when your enemy gets out of combat and is de-aggroed to restore their health back to full. And the reason is a gameplay reason, which is very straightforward, which is that if you don't do this, then players will use sporadic aggro and de-aggro as a tactic to wear down a very superior enemy. So you run in, you do a couple of hits, and you run out, you get to where you're de-aggroed, you heal yourself back up, and if the health of the enemy has not been restored, then this is a potential tactic to just do this over and over again. You could have it on I can't think of the word, so it restores over time rather than instant restoration. And that would be a way of reducing that kind of tactic. But if you want players not to be able to use that at all, then you just give them an instant restore of health when they get back to where they started, or whatever thing you're going to do when they're de-aggro. Okay. So that's been a quick run through and an overview of some of the things that you need to think about as a designer when you're thinking about AI for your enemies. And that is it from me for now.